Hello friends, we are discussing about the pathophysiology of hypertension. In the previous video, we had discussed about renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system, which is an important part of humoral mechanism. So we are discussing the main concept of malfunction in humoral mechanism, which is comprised of three different components. First component was renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system, which we had discussed in the previous video. Today, we will be discussing about rest two humoral component, that is natriuretic hormones or peptide and insulin resistance and hyperinsulinemia. These two are integral part of humoral mechanism, which along with renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system is responsible for persistent elevation in blood pressure. So let us first understand that how this natriuretic hormone or peptide regulate the human blood pressure, and when there is a malfunction in natriuretic hormone peptide release and physiological action, there will be persistent elevation of blood pressure. So first of all, we need to understand that in which situation this natriuretic hormone or peptide release in human body. So let us understand that whenever there is a rise in extracellular fluid, the first condition is whenever there is a rise in extracellular fluid, there will be rise in blood volume. Because of rise in blood volume, as we all know, when we had discussed in our video factor affecting blood pressure, when there is a rise in blood volume, there will be rise in preload. And when there is a rise in preload, the pressure on the walls of heart will increase. And because this cardiac myocytes has to stretch more, when there is a rise in preload, there will be a secretion of natriuretic hormones in the blood. So it is very important for us to understand that whenever the heart is filled with more blood, there will be stretch or certain kind of pressure exerted by blood on the myocytes or walls of heart, and that will release natriuretic hormone as well as peptide in the blood. Why and where this will release, when we discuss, when there will be a high pressure on the atrial system, this will release atrial natriuretic peptide. So as we discuss, if there is a high extracellular fluid, high blood volume, high preload, the atrial system, specifically right atria, will secrete atrial natriuretic peptide in the blood. Second, when there is a stretch on the ventricular wall, when there is a stretch in the ventricular wall, they will release brain natriuretic peptide in the blood. Don't get confused with the word brain, because earlier when brain natriuretic peptide was found, it was extracted from the pig's brain, porcine brain, and because of that the name is given brain natriuretic peptide, but it is released by the walls of ventricles, not from the brain. And the third type, which is very important, that is C-type natriuretic peptide, is initially released from the cortex of brain, and then later on realize that all the endotheliums will release C-type natriuretic peptide. So very precisely we have understood that when there is a rise in extracellular fluid, blood volume, there will be secretion of natriuretic hormone or peptide in the blood. Second, when there is a rise in blood pressure. Whenever there is a rise in blood pressure, there will be more stretch on the walls of myocardium, and that will also lead to secretion of natriuretic peptide. So it is very clear that in which situation natriuretic hormone or peptide will secrete. We will be discussing soon about the physiological action of this natriuretic hormone or peptide in the human blood. But first we need to understand that how it is secreted. Now the second important thing is how this natriuretic hormone or peptide works. So this natriuretic hormone or peptide, when secreted in the blood, they have two type of action. One is paracrine action and second is endocrine action. Now so many people get confused with what is paracrine and what is endocrine cell signaling mechanism. So let us quickly understand the different types of cell signaling mechanism. We will be discussing this cell signaling mechanism to understand the concept of natriuretic hormone physiology in the human body. There are three main types of cell signaling mechanism, that are autocrine, paracrine, endocrine. So first we will discuss about autocrine. What is autocrine cell signaling mechanism? So when the cell is releasing certain kind of substances or hormones or enzyme, and this released substance, this is a substance which is synthesized by the cell. When it released to the extracellular domain, when this released substance, enzyme or substance will be binding on the receptor which is present on the cell which has secreted those enzymes, that is called paracrine mechanism. Let me give you a precise example to understand the autocrine mechanism. So this is, say for example, a macrophage. We all know the macrophage is responsible for secretion of interleukin 1. Interleukin 1 is secreted by macrophage. So let's say this is a macrophage, this is interleukin 1. When it is secreted in the extracellular domain, it will get bind to the macrophage receptor, and then this interleukin 1 will be responsible for more secretion of cytokines from the same cell from where interleukin 1 was secreted. So this is how the cell which is secreting the substance or enzyme is already responsible for again binding to the same cell receptors. It is not traveling far and affecting the adjacent cell or peripheral cell. That is autocrine mechanism. Second is paracrine mechanism. The difference between autocrine and paracrine is, in autocrine mechanism, the action of a substance secreted by the cell is to the cell himself or cell itself. But in paracrine mechanism, the cell which is secreting the substance will be acting on the very adjacent cell, or we can say nearby cell. So say for example, this is a substance. When secreted from the cell, it will go and bind to the cell which is present very near to the cell which is secreted the substance. So say for example, this is a signaling cell and this is a receptor cell. So both will be different in case of paracrine mechanism. Let me give you an example of T cell. So whenever there is a infection or inflammatory condition, this T cell will secrete or stimulate certain substance which will stimulate adjacent T cell, B cell as well as natural killer cell. So these are the cells which are present very nearby. This T cell will be stimulating the fellow T cells, B cells as well as natural killer cell. That is a precise example of paracrine mechanism. And the last is endocrine mechanism. So in endocrine mechanism, when the substance is secreted from the signaling cell, this substance has a capacity to travel to the distant place. So once it is secreted into the extracellular domain, it will be carried by the blood through different parts of a human body, and wherever it finds the effector or receptor, there it will go and bind and it gives action. Let me give you an example. Say for example, in brain, hypothalamus mediated posterior pituitary gland will secrete antidiuretic hormone, ADH, in the blood. Blood carries this ADH to the kidney. In kidney, it will go and bind to the nephrons and it will retain sodium and water. So the hormones which is secreted in the brain region has an action in the kidney, which is very far located from the brain. So this is called endocrine cell signaling mechanism. There are certain other cell signaling mechanism, but these are the most important cell signaling mechanism. We had discussed this mechanism to understand the mechanism or physiology of natriuretic hormone, which work by paracrine as well as endocrine mechanism. Let's understand the physiological action of this natriuretic hormone and peptide which is secreted in the human blood. So there are three types of this natriuretic hormone or peptide. First is atrial natriuretic peptide, which is secreted from the atrial wall, and that is why it is known as atrial natriuretic peptide. Second is brain natriuretic peptide, which is precisely secreted from the ventricles of the heart. And the third is C-type natriuretic peptide, which is secreted from the cortex and endothelium cell of the human body. So once these natriuretic peptides are secreted in the human body, they have physiological action in the various part of human body. So precisely and briefly, if I want to say, this natriuretic hormone has an opposite action to antidiuretic hormone as well as aldosterone. ADH and aldosterone are responsible for sodium and water retention and thus responsible for increasing in the blood volume and increasing in the blood pressure. Whereas this natriuretic peptide or hormone are responsible for excretion of sodium and water, decreasing the blood volume, decreasing the preload and afterload, and decreasing the blood pressure. How this natriuretic peptides works to decrease this sodium as well as water and blood volume, that we will discuss. So the first action of brain and atrial natriuretic peptide is they are having a direct action in the kidney. In the kidney, precisely in the nephron, it leads to renal afferent arterioles vasodilation and renal efferent arterioles vasoconstriction. Let me explain this mechanism with the help of a figure. So when we keep the nephron out of kidney, this is a nephron where this is a Bowman capsule where the filtration actually takes place. This is the afferent arterioles. This is afferent arterioles, which is taking blood from the circulation to the kidney for filtration, and this is efferent arterioles pulling blood from the kidney to return back to the heart for the purification. Now, when there is a rise in ANP, BNP and C type natriuretic peptide, there will be vasodilation of this afferent arterioles, and because of afferent arterioles vasodilation, more amount of blood will come inside the kidney for filtration. Along with that, the second mechanism is there will be a vasoconstriction. There will be constriction of efferent arterioles. So it cannot pull back the blood from the kidney and return to the heart for a while because of the vasoconstriction in the ends of efferent arterioles. And because of this two combined mechanism, the blood will stay for a longer period of time inside the kidney for filtration, and because of that reason there will be rise in this filtration process. This rise in the filtration process will lead to increase in glomerular filtration rate. When there will be increase in blood volume, there will be increase in contact time of this blood vessel and Bowman capsule for the filtration process got enhanced, and because of the enhanced filtration process there will be rise in glomerular filtration rate. Now there are two different types of parts in the nephron. Proximal convoluted tubule and distal convoluted tubule is responsible for sodium reabsorption. They have sodium channel which will reabsorb sodium from the filtrate. Now because of the rise in GFR, there will be rise in the filter which is done in the glomerular region. Rise in GFR led to rise in filter generation, and because there is a rise in GFR, the blood which is purified and that is filtered inside the nephron will pass with the high speed, and because this filtrate is passing through the high speed to the kidney, this sodium channel will get very less contact time with the filtrate to reabsorb the sodium, and thus there is a decrease in sodium reabsorption capacity, and because of that reason sodium will retain in the filtrate and it will move forward. When it reaches to the distal convoluted tubule, again because of high rate there will be less sodium reabsorption, and because of that this sodium will ultimately excrete from the human body, and we all know that lead to rise in natriuresis. Natriuresis is nothing but the excretion of sodium in the urine. As I have explained why there is a excretion of sodium in the urine, and because wherever sodium goes water follows, there will be also rise in the water elimination or excretion, and this lead to decrease in blood volume because of rise in sodium and water excretion, and this decrease in blood volume will decrease the preload and afterload, and it will decrease the stretch on myocardium or I can say heart, and there will be no release of natriuretic hormone or peptide in the body. So this is how ANP, BNP and C-type natriuretic peptide has a direct action in the kidney. Second most important action of ANP, BNP and C-type natriuretic peptide is it decreases sympathetic outflow. Now let me explain that when there is a rise in sympathetic outflow, there is a rise in norepinephrine level. When there is a rise in norepinephrine level, in kidney, juxtaglomerular separators are responsible for secretion of renin because they have beta-1 receptor, and this beta-1 receptor is stimulated by norepinephrine, which is secreted by the sympathetic nerve endings, and that will activate renin, angiotensin, aldosterone system. But this natriuretic hormone and peptide are inhibiting sympathetic outflow, so they are not stimulating beta-1 receptor, and because of that they are not stimulating renin release, and that will not activate renin, angiotensin, aldosterone system. If it gets activated, it leads to increase in blood pressure. We have precisely explained in our previous video, which was about renin, angiotensin, aldosterone system. So that is the second mechanism. The third mechanism is this atrial natriuretic peptide and brain natriuretic peptide has a direct action on the blood vessel. What they will do is it leads to vasodilation. Now, when this ANP and BNP leads to vasodilation, if it is dilating the venous system, it will decrease the venous return. It is decreasing venous return, so it is decreasing preload, and when the preload is decreased, stroke volume is decreased, cardiac output is decreased, and systolic blood pressure is decreased. If there is a vasodilation in the arterial system, there will be decrease in afterload. There will be decrease in total peripheral resistance, and that will decrease the diastolic blood pressure. So that is having a direct action on blood vessel. Third and most important action of this natriuretic peptide is via guanylate cyclase receptor. It also indirectly inhibits the release of aldosterone, which is responsible for sodium and water retention. That is also inhibited by the natriuretic peptide. Third and precise mechanism of C-type natriuretic peptide is they are decreasing cell growth and remodeling in the cardiac region. In the last video, we had discussed that whenever there is a rise in angiotensin 2, aldosterone, there will be remodeling of cardiac myocytes because of the growth-like action of aldosterone and angiotensin 2. This remodeling leads to acute decongestion or acute congestive heart failure. So this will be prevented by C-type natriuretic peptide. When it is secreted, it inhibits the cellular growth and remodeling of the cardiac myocytes and prevent or preserve the cardiac function. So that action is mediated by guanylate cyclase receptor, and that is why I have mentioned guanylate cyclase receptor for the two important function or physiological action of natriuretic peptide. Now this natriuretic peptide or hormones are secreted more in the human body in three different conditions. The first condition is congestive heart failure, second condition is persistent elevation in blood pressure, and third condition is cor pulmonale. These are the three different conditions where these natriuretic peptides are secreted more in the human body. Now after understanding the physiological action of natriuretic peptide, we need to understand and go back to the main concept of malfunctioning humoral mechanism. If there is a malfunction in secretion of natriuretic peptide or hormone, there will be imbalance in the controlling blood pressure, and because of that reason there will be persistent elevation in blood pressure. So that is how natriuretic hormone or peptide play an important role in maintaining the blood pressure, and any abnormality leads to either rise or decrease in blood pressure, which is not normal for a human body. Now let us discuss about the third and important humoral mechanism, that is insulin resistance or hyperinsulinemia. Now when there is a high secretion of insulin in the human body, insulin is having certain physiological action. These physiological actions of insulin will also contribute to disturb the blood pressure, and that, if not treated, leads to increase in blood pressure. So important component of this humoral mechanism is also insulin resistance or hyperinsulinemia. Now let us understand what insulin will do and contribute for elevation in blood pressure. So insulin, when the secreted in human body by beta pancreatic cells, it will lead to retention of sodium. So first physiological action of insulin is sodium retention. It is similar to aldosterone antidiuretic hormone. When insulin is secreted more by the beta pancreatic cell, it will increase the efficiency of sodium channel which is located in the nephron, and retention of sodium will be more inside the extracellular fluid or inside the blood. So because of increasing the efficiency of sodium channel, insulin is increasing the sodium retention, and along with sodium it will also retain the water, and because of the sodium and water retention from the kidney, it is increasing the blood volume. Because of there is a rise in blood volume, as we know, there will be rise in venous return, and that lead to increase in preload, and this increase in preload lead to increase in systolic blood pressure. So this is how insulin is responsible for retention of sodium and water and mediated blood pressure. The second mechanism of insulin is insulin increases the intracellular calcium concentration. Now if we go to the action potential mechanism, in order to generate action potential, there is a exchange of certain ions. Now sodium will come inside the cell, and then calcium will come inside the cell, potassium will leave outside the cell, and then there will be restoration of this electrolyte. So when there is a restoration of electrolyte, this is sodium potassium co-transporter. Because potassium is a intracellular cation and calcium is an extracellular cation, this co-transporter will eliminate calcium from the cell to the extracellular fluid and getting back potassium from the extracellular fluid inside the cell. This insulin blocks this calcium potassium co-transporter, and thus it will increase the concentration of calcium inside the cell. So that will lead to increase in intracellular calcium concentration. This rise in intracellular calcium concentration leads to contraction of vascular smooth muscle, and because of the contraction of vascular smooth muscle, there will be rise in vascular resistance, which is nothing but the afterload, total peripheral resistance. So due to calcium mediated narrowing of arteries and vein because of contraction, it leads to increase in vascular resistance, it leads to increase in systolic as well as diastolic blood pressure. That is the second mechanism of insulin. Third, when the insulin is secreted in more amount inside the human blood, it is increasing sympathetic nervous system. And in sympathetic nervous system, when there is an increasing sympathetic outflow, as we all know, norepinephrine will bind to the different receptors, adrenergic receptor present in the kidney and heart as well as vascular smooth muscle, and it will activate renin-angiotensin system. It will increase heart rate, contractility and contraction of vascular smooth muscle and lead to increase in blood pressure. So that is also contributing to the rise in blood pressure, insulin mediated sympathetic outflow, which will increase, and sympathetic outflow when increases, it leads to increase in the blood pressure. The third and most important mechanism of insulin is a growth hormone like action. Insulin is one of the hormone which is having growth hormone like action, and because of that action, it is leading to hypertrophy of vascular smooth muscle. So if you see, this is normal blood vessel. Blood vessel are consisted of vascular smooth muscle. This blood vessel get thickened because of growth inside the cell, because of growth hormone like action, and that will decrease the diameter. The diameter or the lumen diameter gets decreased, and because of that there will be no smooth flowing of blood from the blood vessel, and this lead to decrease in the decrease in the diameter of blood vessel leads to increase in total peripheral resistance, or we can say vascular resistance, and that leads to increase in blood pressure. So these are the 4 different mechanisms of insulin which is responsible for increase in blood pressure. Now here the concept of metabolic syndrome is very important. What is metabolic syndrome? This is not metabolic disorder. Metabolic disorder as well as metabolic syndrome are completely different. In case of metabolic syndrome, when there is a rise in blood pressure along with certain metabolic abnormality, it is combinedly known as metabolic syndrome. And one of the component is when there is a rise in blood pressure and rise in insulin, that is responsible for metabolic syndrome like conditions. So this is all about malfunction in humoral mechanism, which is comprised of 3 different parts which we had discussed: renin, angiotensin, aldosterone system in the previous video, and in this video natriuretic hormone and insulin resistance or hyperinsulinemia. In the next video we will be discussing about neuronal regulation. As we had discussed in the pathophysiology of hypertension, there are 4 different mechanisms which is responsible for persistent elevation in blood pressure. We had discussed humoral mechanism in detail, and now in the next video we will be discussing about neuronal regulation and how alteration in neuronal regulation leads to persistent elevation in blood pressure. If you like this video, please subscribe the channel and share your views in the comment box. Thank you for watching. Keep learning, keep watching, keep growing.